The next presentation comes from another one of our remote researchers, Jie Shen, who is based in Shanghai. And Jie's research is connected in many ways to a kind of program within a program, which we developed in response to the coronavirus pandemic, which we called Revenge of the Real, which was an event, also an online event many of you may have seen, in which our researchers developed research on the pandemic kind of midstream. And we also had lectures, interventions from Jean-Luc Nancy, Holly Jean Buck, Jeff Menon, Nicola William, myself, among others. Jie's work takes this thread and pulls it a bit further. It's looking specifically at China's response to the pandemic, techniques that perhaps the rest of the world should have learned from more actively, perhaps not. But one of the things that we do see even now, at the beginning of July of 2020, is as the pandemic continues, one of the things we recognize is that we're in the midst of one of perhaps the largest experiments in comparative governance that we're likely to see in our lifetimes, with the virus as a kind of control panel. How different systems are responding to the pandemic, this essentially a kind of a control variable that is indifferent to the semiotics we might project upon it, is making some things quite clear. Certain kinds of governing systems are failing rather catastrophically. Others have succeeded. Some aspects of central command and control have worked, while others have not. Some strength of a more emergent liberal techniques of a kind of emergent liberalism have worked in certain respects in response to the virus, while others have left their societies in a kind of numb and incoherent daze. Each system faces the same test, and the results are plain to see. The question now is how to interpret them. One of the ways in which Jie's work, looking again specifically at China's response, one of the ways it might might be seen in the West is through a lens of what we sort of colloquially call surveillance, quote unquote. And also some of the ways in which the responses may demand a little bit of an opening up of that term, not to necessarily come to the conclusion that there are forms of surveillance that are all right, but rather that some of the forms of observation, modeling, and governance through distributed data systems are not only beneficial, but don't necessarily would suggest terminology quite different than surveillance and the kind of connotations that it would bring with it. And if so, it would suggest ways in which many people are sort of seeing these technologies perhaps anew, realizing and becoming quite clear how their potential has been suppressed by the tyranny of engagement, let alone advertising in the past. So, obviously, and you'll see some of these examples here of things like infection tracking and so forth, clearly in confrontation with certain principles of libertarian anonymity, but a more generous and what we call an epidemiological view of society, in which the immunological commons is, in a way, non-negotiable, would in fact put that framing in a different context and might lead us towards different conclusions about the valuations of the choices available to us. None of which is to say that this debate is easy or that it's anyway made easier by this circumstance. Quite the opposite, which is why we're interested in it. But it is opened up, and I think some certain fault lines are clarified by this. Certain ways in which we might reflexively respond to certain kinds of techniques as pernicious forms of social control, for example, suggest that we may wish to compose a more nuanced vocabulary for how it is that we evaluate them, one way or the other. The last point with Jie's research, which it's important to indicate up front, is an analysis of the concept of resilience and a complexification of this term of resilience to mean not only something that is inflexible, but quite the opposite, but something that can in fact respond to unforeseen circumstances in ways that it can nevertheless still provide structure and form to that circumstance, regardless of the unforeseeability. Another way in which this resilience is seen to work and to become coterminous to a certain degree with robustness is in terms of complexity. One of the conclusions that her work suggests is that complexity, we may be accustomed to thinking about resilience and robustness in terms of simplification, that the simpler a system is, the more robust it is, and the less prone it might be to some kind of eruptive breakdown. And indeed, the logic of contagion would suggest this. Jie's conclusion is, in fact, comes from a different side, suggests that, in fact, instead of seeing complexity as fragile, we see it as the basis of adaptability and resilience. And so with that, I'll let Jie make the contribution to research of the case studies that she's analyzed for us. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jie Shen, and currently I'm based in Shanghai. And my research interest is about the philosophy of technology in relation to psychology, cognitive science. And currently in the terraforming content, I will examine how the automation systems can enable resilience in aspect of urban and socio-political. And I will use 3 or 4 Chinese cases studies to do these examinations. And I hope you can like it. Automation and resilience, COVID-19 crisis in China. My presentation within the terraforming context will examine how automation, mainly in Benjamin Britton's sense, can enable resilience in urban systems, governance mechanisms, and perhaps in ecosystems. Doing so, I will highlight 3 case studies in China dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. When crisis strikes, the short-term solution is to reduce the damage. For the long term, resilience is needed to enhance the strength to absorb and even prevent future crises. To do so, advanced technologies are required, as they come with infrastructure and socio-political transformation, and can be guided to work for ecosystems. During the COVID-19 pandemic in China, many technical approaches were used or developed to enhance resilience. Number 1, sensing and prevention. The first example illustrates how sensing infrastructure in China is used to trace the virus. To deal with crisis, we need to know better the situation and the risk levels. How can the specific risk of regional ecosystems to be most efficiently sensed or measured? To do so demands a different perspective. According to Benjamin Britton, this is a term from the human-centered perspective in Anthropocene age to non-human-centered vision in post-Anthropocene age. The non-human-centered perspective focuses less on individuals' ideas or cultures, but more on material transformation of biochemistry, regional ecosystems, including cities. This human perspective can be captured by sensors such as smart devices, cameras, and infrastructure. In China, Sensing systems were already embedded in the infrastructure as part of the government and private sector's surveillance. For example, China's real-name train ticketing system. Surveillance has many privacy concerns, but today I don't have time to deal with it. Briefly, from the non-human-centered perspective, the objective of the sensing is the spread of the virus to prevent further contagion rather than for controlling individuals or society. Before Wuhan's lockdown, about 5 million people left to other cities for the long Chinese New Year holiday. The majority took trains. The train networks, through tracking passengers, also traced the path of the spreading virus to other cities. Once passengers were confirmed as having COVID-19, the train section on which they had traveled were marked as red, and the public were warned. The ticketing system required all passengers to use their state-issued identification, and the state ID database has the names, address, and other personal information of all Chinese citizens. In this way, by linking the information on the train and the government ID database, other passengers on the same red train can be identified as potential virus carriers and notified. Chinese private tech giants Baidu and Tencent have already tracked their app users' locations. They establish time-space patterns of migration, specifically where and when passengers arrived. Through the machine vision, the tracing data helps measure more directly the pandemic risk and make them more communicable and predictive. One study concluded that Baidu and Tencent's data together can explain between 67% to almost 99% of the COVID-19 cases. The data enhance the recipient city's prediction abilities and preparation, such as readying doctors and medical equipment. Indeed, a potential risk reflected is that those private tech giants own a large number of data and use them for commercial aims. Therefore, the way to use and manage data is very important political issues. A further question is that what new kind of governance and actions will accompany these measurements and sensations? Number 2, algorithmic governance. Based on the machine sensing, the politics in China is shifting to algorithmic governance. What underlies this shift is the transformation of the decision-making process. For Benjamin Brighton, the new forms of decision-making can be shaped by geotechnologies. Since the geotechnology can measure, simulate, and calculate, they can automatically generate decisions rather than relying on self-conscious executive choices. Here, humans' role during the decision-making process gives way to an infrastructure-based automation system, which also can be described as a computational performance. For example, who should be regarded as a potential COVID-19 patient and who should be quarantined is hard to be answered by administrative staff. However, these decisions can be made by automation systems, the health code systems. The algorithms evaluate risk levels based on sensed data, summarized with a 3-color output. Social governance, in fact, relies much on these automated evaluations during this pandemic in China. The algorithmically produced codes quickly and effectively identify and organize potential affected persons, which enables resilience. However, the tension between governance and private companies exists. The health QR code was developed by Chinese tech giants Alibaba and Tencent and adopted by local governments, initially without a central government oversight. From May, Chinese central government sets the rules and protocols to standardize the health codes. By enacting regulations, governments not only harness the strengths of tech giants, but also ensure the nature of the use of these codes. The automated governance might be the logical of social governance after the pandemic. In May, the city of Hangzhou released an idea of a gradient health code that can monitor more precisely health conditions, as it considers not only hospital records but also your lifestyles, like smoking or running. Another upgrade of health code in China is city QR code, under development by Tencent, which aims to transform the health platforms into a digital public service platforms. It was connected to communities, transport, and government service whole, and so on. A further direction of these systems should emphasize more on the prevention of future crises by managing current potential risks based on geographic sensing, which can make the whole systems more resilient. Number 3, contributory work and techno diversity. Another way to prevent future climate crisis is mental diversity opened up by the technologies. The third example illustrates how people develop technology and new thinking by transforming traditions and restrictions. One of the traditions in China is repression of free speech. In the digital era, including online censorship for thinking. During the COVID-19 crisis, online posts speaking the truth and providing evidence about the government's inconsistent responses and broken systems were strictly banned or deleted, including a report called Wuhan Doctor warning about the novel virus. However, Chinese people avoid and overcome those strictly censorship on the thinking by collective engagement and creations. Soon after deletion of that report, many people translated it into various languages, including ancient Chinese, English, German, ancient Hebrew, Klingon language. These translations were shared on WeChat. Moreover, some established GitHub repositories to store these banned or deleted voices, because GitHub's decentralized structure was beyond the reach of government's repression. More importantly, these creations transformed GitHub and WeChat from hosting service and social network into socio-political relays, which forced some government department and social forms to change. To summarize, these examples from the COVID-19 pandemic in China show that resilience include not only rapid relief and the prevention of crises, but also the transformation of government's mechanisms and technologies.